Alright, so let's talk about the Assyrian Empire. Not to be confused with Syria today, this was a powerhouse civilization that dominated the ancient Near East from around 900 to 600 BCE. Think modern-day Iraq, plus chunks of Iran, Turkey, and Syria. And if you're imagining a place where you'd want to go sightseeing, take a step back. This was one of history's most brutally efficient war machines. And if you were alive back then, and not part of the club, your life expectancy just dropped to maybe next week. The Assyrians weren't the first civilization in Mesopotamia, but they were definitely the most aggressive. They took warfare to a whole new level. Before them, ancient armies fought in loose formations and relied mostly on bronze tools. The Assyrians introduced iron weaponry, siege engines, disciplined military units, and even early psychological warfare. They had standing armies, logistics networks, and knew how to intimidate. They didn't just beat enemies. They wanted people to remember the consequences of fighting back. One of the more infamous practices involved what we'd now call state-sponsored terror. After capturing cities, Assyrian kings often recorded, on walls, statues, and tablets, exactly how they punished the inhabitants. Impalement, flaying, and mass deportations were common. This wasn't just cruelty, it was propaganda. The message was clear: surrender, and you might live. Resist, and your city becomes an instructional diagram for pain. The rulers of Assyria weren't shy about all this. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III would have historians carve detailed records of their conquests. These weren't sanitized, polished court records. These were graphic reports of the violence they used to hold the empire together. That's why so much of what we know today about Assyria comes from their own inscriptions. We know they built vast cities, like Nineveh and Kalhu, and that they had one of the most advanced administrative systems in the ancient world. But we also know that public executions weren't just punishment, they were messaging. Economically, the empire was powered by conquest. They took tribute from conquered peoples, and when those people couldn't pay, or tried to rebel, they were often relocated by force. Assyrians pioneered mass deportation as a tool of empire. Moving populations around helped destabilize local identities and made uprisings harder to organize. It also meant more workers and soldiers for the Assyrian state. Now, you might wonder, how did this brutal system last for so long? Well, they didn't rule only through fear. The Assyrians also invested in infrastructure. They built roads, aqueducts, and an early postal system that let messages travel hundreds of miles in days. Their capital cities were filled with temples, libraries, and palaces. In fact, King Ashurbanipal, one of the last major rulers, created one of the first great libraries of the ancient world in Nineveh. Thousands of clay tablets have survived, giving us insights into literature, science, religion, and law in Mesopotamia. Religion was central to Assyrian life. The king was seen as chosen by the chief god Ashur. War was more than politics. It was a divine mission. When kings expanded the empire, they weren't just taking land. They were doing the god Ashur's will. This fusion of religion and governance made the empire's structure more resilient, but also more oppressive. Resistance wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege. Daily life for an average Assyrian depended heavily on class. If you were a farmer or craftsman, you paid taxes, followed state religion, and kept your head down. Women had some legal rights, but society was rigidly patriarchal. Laws were strict, especially regarding property, marriage, and religion. The economy was mostly agrarian, but trade flourished thanks to the empire's roads and secured borders. Art and literature thrived in royal courts, though if you were poor, you were probably too busy surviving to care about poetry. Despite their power, the empire eventually collapsed under its own weight. Constant warfare drained resources. Rebellions, especially from Babylonians and Medes, intensified. Around 612 BCE, a coalition of enemies sacked Nineveh. The empire fragmented and faded into history, though its legacy lived on in later Mesopotamian and Persian cultures. So yeah, unless you were rich, ruthless, or royalty, the Assyrian Empire was less cradle of civilization and more blender with a flag. Good luck out there.